Everywhere that neoliberal colonialism goes, its first task is to destroy the traditional foundations of that society, to create individuals, to normalize capitalist and Western forms of thinking, cost-benefit analysis in our everyday relationships. This is the role of psychology, as I discussed in my last videos. It's so unfortunate that it's so difficult to find articles like this, but today I will be discussing a work by Carol Johnson back in 1996 called Does Capitalism Really Need Patriarchy? It's so really unfortunate that, when you search patriarchy and capitalism on any type of scholarly search engine, you find thousands and thousands of repeated ideas and these idioms that keep going everywhere, this inability to think. Well, we all know the story of how the Engelsian story of how capitalism and patriarchy are connected. We all know the intersectional narratives that we've been raised by and that we are constantly reminded of. But these stories, they simplify what is much more complicated, a much more complicated story. So I'm going to read this for you. Synopsis. In a time when socialism is in crisis and free market policies remain influential, it is pertinent to reassess the relationship between feminism and capitalism. A large body of feminist literature, this is in 1996, right? And even back then, Carol Johnson is at the University of Adelaide in Australia is talking about this stuff and how it's so difficult to find actual critique, actual thinking. Everybody is repeating the same mantra. When everybody repeats the same mantra, when everybody repeats the same ideology, you really need to be careful, This is my point. Capitalism and patriarchy have different gods. And patriarchy is not about male supremacy. Patriarchy is about the supremacy of the father in the household. The patriarchy exists in the ancient Greek societies because the father is willing to put his life on the line to defend the society. That's why he has property, a willingness to defend the city-state, and that's how he gets a vote in the republic. This separation between putting your life on the line and having a vote is actually very problematic between the idea of democracy and republic. I think that's why I'm a little bit, that's why they call people conservative in this sense. Maybe this is my own conservatism in that sense, where I believe that you really need to participate and put something into the community before you even have a vote. Otherwise, you shouldn't have a vote in a way. A vote isn't just, a willy-nilly, what affects me. You need to be participating in that society. You need to be putting some investment in that society. Right now, what's happening is a lot of people are free riding off of the votes, whether it's the right-wing, neoliberal right wing or the neoliberal left wing. All of these people are free riding upon our collective labor. Our collective labor is turned into these individual cost-benefit analysis. And when it's turned into an individual cost-benefit analysis, the collective society actually dies. And we can actually see that in this article that we're going to be discussing here. So let's get into it. Does capitalism really need patriarchy? Some Old Issues Reconsidered by Carol Johnson in 1996. Synopsis. In a time when socialism is in crisis and free market policies remain influential, it is pertinent to reassess the relationship between feminism and capitalism. A large body of feminist literature argues that capitalism and patriarchy are at least highly compatible. This is in 1996. Indeed, in Anne Phillips's view, there is now a consensus in the area of women in work. Phillips believes that the two systems are closely intertwined, that neither system could be privileged over the other in explaining the problems of women at work. Carol Pateman's work on the sexual contract challenges that consensus by suggesting that capitalism is virtually a form of patriarchy. This article makes takes issue with the analysis of both Pateman and those who stress the compatibility of the two systems by emphasizing the tensions that exist between capitalism and patriarchy, and by showing that the patriarchal form of the wage relation had to be fought for rather than being a foregone conclusion. So in this work, my perspective as a colonized person is from the outside of capitalism. I'm from a very small village, and how I see capitalism invading is from this, third world kind of perspective. But this article talks about within the Western forms of how capitalism and patriarchy basically made a deal with one another. There were maximum amounts of tensions between these two forms of systems, and how the idea of marriage and the idea of this Fordism, this developing Fordism, and they were at odds with one another. And we've discussed in the past, it's pretty well known in the feminist literature how feminism, what it did was it became kind of individualistic, where men and women in the family now both have to become a breadwinner in the family. This is kind of that idea, but it's going to really go into it and really analyze those kinds of orthodoxies that exist within academia. And when you question them, this is why, I make these blatant statements like intersectionality is integral to the logic of neoliberal colonialism, or the title of this video is probably going to be something like patriarchy is opposed to capitalism, because I have to make this kind of staunch perspective, because just to balance out the number of articles that keep repeating the same shit versus the actual critical thinking process that sees the more complicated aspects where, it's not just that patriarchy and capitalism and heteronormativity and sexism and racism and all these things are all one big monster that if we all work together, we can, this kind of bullshit, when we don't actually discuss the complications that happen within intersectionality, within the different intersections. And this is kind of why I pointed to the four horsemen of the left in my last video, pointing to the karmic union capitalists, the intersectional neoliberals, the tankies who defend autarky and against their idea of what colonialism might be, and number 4, which is the Islamic left, the leftist Islamic Palestinian struggle, that, and all of these forms, they assume intersectionality. They assume that we'll all be on the same side, when it's just not true. And if we don't take those tensions seriously, we're not going anywhere. And those tensions can continually be pressed at by the capitalist class to fuck with us, to fuck with our unity, right? So intersectionality, what it does is kind of wash over the very real conversations that need to be had. And that's why I'm just straight up against intersectionality. And when people hear that, they think that, I'm a right-wing, alt-left, alt-right guy. But really what I'm trying to do is, make friends with that devil's advocate position, which unfortunately now is a form of toxic masculinity, to make friends with that position in order so that we might move towards something more positive, something more beneficial, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the road to heaven, the gateway to heaven, is opened by the devil's advocate only. That's kind of the philosophy that motivates this. This article, back to the text, this article tackles what is very old and some may believe outdated question, namely the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy. However, it could be argued that far from being passé, the question of the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy confronts us today in even more challenging forms as feminists face the effects of capitalist globalization and continuing influence of the right and current decline of socialism, both in the Eastern Bloc, this is written in 1996, and at least for the moment in the West. If capitalism is indissolubly linked to patriarchy, the immediate outlook for feminism may look bleak indeed. Surely it is most appropriate time for us to reconsider some of the links between the two systems. 1996. This article criticizes conceptions of the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy that see them as either being one integrated system or two highly compatible systems. Instead, a case is made for looking again at some of the tensions and conflicts that can exist between capitalism and patriarchy. Wonderful. I go so far as to say that they're completely different systems. One is the religion of profit, and the other is the religion of the father. And these two are completely different things. The father demands, that you die for the state, that you put your life on the line for completely different things. And the profit motive demands an extraction of surplus capital. These are totally different religions. And if they work together at times, that's just coincidental rather than, and in fact, in this article, we're going to see that they aren't going to be working together at all. It discusses a number of positions paying particularly detailed attention to the work of Carol Pateman, 1988, that makes important new contributions to the debate at a theoretical level. Much of the 1970s and 80s debate over the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy arose in the context of socialist feminist critiques of crude Marxist conceptions that saw class relations as a primary importance in explaining women's oppression. Sargent, 1981. Socialists, feminists sought to retain some of the insights of Marxism while rejecting class reductionism. Consequently, influential socialist feminists such as Heidi Hartman argued that there was a partnership between the interests of capital and the interests of patriarchy in constructing modern forms of women's subordination. By the late 1980s, Anne Phillips could argue that most contemporary feminist writing on women and work has converged on the notion that class and gender intertwine. And few feminists now associate with this position that sees the problems of women as workers or as being caused predominantly by capitalists or men. Phillips went on to caution against constructing the debate in terms of capitalism versus patriarchy, arguing that there was not any universal priority, that the key issues shift through context and time as our male-structured capitalism poses different sets of problems to different sets of women. Similar perspectives that capitalism and patriarchy are indissolubly intertwined comes from writers engaged with post-structuralist issues of identity and difference, and arguing against establishing a hierarchy of oppression. For example, Linda Briskin, 1990, argues against conceiving them as separate systems, arguing that if we analyze not the separate systems of capitalism and patriarchy, but historically specific forms of patriarchal capitalism, if we study the gendered character of capitalism and the classified character of gender, then we must also repudiate the notion of class and gender as separate systems. I mean, this makes things even more worse, right? In a sense, we should be talking about patriarchal capitalism, but that is a system in and of itself. It kind of reminds me of this intersectional argument where, I am not a woman, I am not just black, I am a black woman. This kind of intersectional argument, whereas it doesn't really apply to the patriarchy versus capitalism. We should be talking about patriarchal capitalism. Yes, that's one system that could be analyzed as one system. But the patriarchy, there's many different forms of patriarchy, right? There's anti-capitalist forms of patriarchy. There's religious patriarchy. There's secular patriarchy. Patriarchy isn't just, one thing. And patriarchy is, older than capitalism, I guess. So it's obvious that there's going to be tensions between patriarchy and capitalism. And to assume that they're one system is just oversimplifying. This article does not intend to set up an opposition that privileges capitalism over patriarchy or vice versa in influencing women's lives, nor does it suggest that there are clear hierarchies of oppression in which either class or gender can be privileged over the other. I mean, every article that you read now in the academia, they all have to do these kinds of, I showed that picture, that movie, Planet of the Apes, where, we all have to first pay homage to the indoctrination that we've received, and then and then, give all these qualifications, oh yeah, of course the system as it is correct, and the academic system is correct, and then they have to criticize it. So you have to do all of these step arounds and all these qualifications just to get at the point that you're trying to make. Nor does it suggest that there are clear hierarchies of oppression in which either class or gender can be privileged over the other. Nor does it seek to question the useful work done by Phillips and others on such matters as gender segregation in the workforce, the currently disadvantaged position of women in the labor market, and the role of gendered roles played historically in constructing class identifications and boundaries. It's so crazy how we live in this theocracy. Academia is such a theocracy. It's just basically like when, Islamic judicial people have to say, oh, well, all of the conservative ideas are correct, and now we can go on and criticize it. This is not just in this paper. This is in 1996, and you can find, especially for someone like me trying to find actual critique, every time I try to find some critique, there's thousands of qualifications, and then finally, once you explain yourself and you understand the systems and you understand intersectionality and you understand that, and now you can finally critique whatever it is that you wanted to critique. It's theology. It's a theology. It's a theocracy, these university systems. It's scary. However, this article does wish to address the question of whether capitalism needs to be inherently male structured, approaching the issue from a broadly socialist feminist perspective. In other words, while not wishing to deny the importance, I wouldn't actually wish to deny the importance of class for people's lives, the gendered nature of contemporary capitalism, nor the oppressive nature of contemporary class relationships, the question remains of whether the existence of class relations necessitates the continuing subordination of women. So you can see that this whole bell Hooksian line, this intersectional bell Hooksian line, intersectionality existed, way before bell hooks, way before Crenshaw. These ideas were part of the mores that these people took up. Crenshaw and bell hooks, they were raised in the same system, the same ideological system, the same colonial academic system that we were all raised by. Colonialism is deep. This is my point. Colonialism is much deeper than we can all even begin to imagine. And we have to understand the really difficult idea of complicity. And once you do that, once you start actually digging and once you start actually questioning all of these papers that we've been raised by, you actually start, all of this mental health stuff really becomes much more simple. It's really funny how that works. My mind is so clear because of my actual ability to separate what are my own traumas from the traumas of others. So back to the article. Yes, this article does not wish to criticize any perceived already pre-established ideas, and it doesn't seek to do such a thing. This is a different issue from one avoiding hierarchies of oppression, but a question that often gets lost in the attempts to escape from privileging either class or gender. As Phillips, 1987, herself acknowledges, the relationship posited between capitalism and patriarchy has important political implications. While she draws attention to the question posed for the left, Phillips, 1987, page 21, I'd wish to argue that the question is, if anything, of much broader significance in a time when versions of right-wing economics are still so influential, even if they do not take quite as extreme a form as they did in the 1980s. An understanding of the depths of the tensions between capitalism and patriarchy may well be essential if feminists are to salvage significant advances in a period in which the left is, hopefully only temporarily, in decline. I'm so sorry, 1996, Carol Johnson. The left is absolutely dead now. Furthermore, this is so crazy. Back then, I didn't think that there was such a pessimism back then. I guess it was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, furthermore, the issue of the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy has also been raised in somewhat new form in recent theoretical literature that questions the consensus Phillips believes exists in material dealing with women and work. Here, the intertwining of capitalism and patriarchy is also accepted, but in a way that tends to privilege patriarchal explanations by depicting capitalism as just another patriarchal form. This is even worse than the argument that I'm assuming. Carol Pateman's book, The Sexual Contract, 1988, seems certain to become a modern classic of feminist political theory. In it, Pateman provides an erudite and trenchant critique of social contract theory, arguing that contracts not merely presuppose social relationships characterized by subordination rather than equal exchange, but that more particularly, they presuppose the subordination of women to men in marriage contract. Pateman concentrates on discussing the marriage contract, the capitalist employment contract, and the slave contract. It should be noted that Pateman claims she is not telling a new feminist story of patriarchal origins, but rather deconstructing a patriarchal story of origins, contract theory, to tell another story that reveals a prior contract, the sexual contract, based on the subordination of women. Okay, so from a Derridan perspective, we should always be critical of origins and understand that, when we use the idea of origins, it's just a placeholder. However, in fact, she slides uneasily between the level of myth and realism. Her story does presuppose a particular historical trajectory. So, for example, she argues that the capitalist employment contract presupposes the subordination of women in the marriage contract. In her words, the marriage contract is not like an employment contract. Rather, the employment contract presupposes the marriage contract. Or, to make this point another way, this construction of the so-called worker presupposes that he is a man who has a wife, a housewife, to take care of his daily needs. You can see that this is a real distortion that's happening here. Consequently, capitalism is reduced to a form of patriarchy. Capitalism and class have been constructed as modern patriarchal categories. So she even takes class as subordinate to patriarchy as well. The social contract is about the origins of the civil sphere and capitalist relations. Without the sexual contract, there is no indication that the worker is a masculine figure or that the working class is the class of men. The civil public sphere does not come into being on its own, and the worker, his work, and his working class cannot be understood independently of the private sphere and his conjugal rights as a husband. The attributes and activities of the worker are constructed together with and as the other side of those of his feminine counterpart, the housewife. In such passages, Pateman is being partially influenced by some versions of radical feminism that see patriarchy as the ultimate shaper of other forms of oppression. Simultaneously, her arguments also reveal the influence of socialist feminist arguments that capitalism and patriarchy are highly compatible. Indeed, this passage occurs in the context of a debate with Hartman's conception of the partnership between the dual systems of capitalism and patriarchy. However, Pateman specifically rejects dual system arguments that patriarchy predates capitalism and now in some way exists alongside or within or as adjunct to capitalist relations, arguing that if capitalism is patriarchal, it is hard to see what can be gained by insisting that there are two systems. She goes on to argue that one of the advantages of approaching the question of patriarchy through the story of sexual contract is that it reveals that civil society, including the capitalist economy, has a patriarchal structure. By contrast, Pateman argues that in order to understand modern patriarchy, including capitalist economic relations, one needs to keep in mind that the relationship between the marriage contract and the employment contract. For Pateman, capitalism is in effect depicted as another version of patriarchy. The question of whether capitalism needs to be patriarchal cannot really arise in a formulation that collapses the two into one system. In this article, I intend to tell another story of origins, one that fits much less neatly than Pateman's narrative, and one that she overlooks because of the particular radical and socialist feminist perspectives she engages with and which inform her work. Not just inform her work, not just she just engages with. Our whole academic system repeats this shit over and over and over again. The academia itself is this polarized citational echo chamber where people keep citing each other when nobody actually engages in critique, right? So this paper is in 1996 I had to go find. I wish to tell a story of conflict and contradiction between competing rather than dependent contracts, a story of the opposition between capitalist employment and patriarchal marriage contracts. This is a story that is rarely told because, as the previous discussion reveals, while much radical feminist theory assumes that capitalism is a product of patriarchy, much socialist feminist theory assumes that capitalism is compatible with patriarchy. These are assumptions that will be contested here, for the onset of capitalism posed a major threat to the patriarchal marriage contract, a threat that had to be met by male workers mobilizing to exclude or marginalize female labor from the employment contract. Far from being inherently patriarchal, capitalism's current patriarchal form may, in the very distant future, prove to be transitory, one that is under increasing threat as feminists or various political persuasions attempt to become both equal workers in the employment contract and equal capitalists. It's worse than that, my friend, Madame Johnson. Now they get affirmative action, and all of these women work affirmative action claims that actually make it much harder for this idea of equality, right? This work will largely be addressing the issue of the logic of capitalism rather than being confined to historically existing forms. In other words, the argument does not assume that historically existing relationships between capitalism and patriarchy can be used to predict future forms. She does do a good job of predicting future forms, though. She says that this relationship between patriarchy and capitalism is going to be, in the distant future, there's going to be more tension as feminists have more employment in the workplace, and not just employment, affirmative action. Nonetheless, since Pateman and other commentators do draw on historical material, it is worth pointing out that there is some historical basis for questioning Pateman's story of the development of contracts. So before I move forward, and the worst example of this affirmative action situation where people have to repeat these empty intersectional lines is the case of Carrie Burisow, this person who's been lying about her heritage for 20 years and creating a lie and getting her sister to lie for her. This sociopath, all of these sociopaths, it's not just her. Lots of people are bullshitting like their Métis or their native status in Canada, or there's plenty of these people that use these affirmative actions. It's basically where all these sociopaths who are lying about their marginalization get ahead. It's much worse than capitalism, right? It's much worse than straight up exploiting surplus labor. You're lying. There's all these liars are getting ahead. It's really crazy. Let us begin with an historical example that Pateman does use, one that is very familiar to the Australian-influenced feminists such as Pateman and myself, namely the Harvester Judgment of 1907. In this judgment, as Pateman points out, Justice Higgins of the Australian Industrial Arbitration Court rules in favor of a legally guaranteed minimum wage and defined a living wage as sufficient to keep an unskilled worker, his wife, and 3 children in reasonable comfort. Interesting. In 1918, the same Justice Higgins went on to establish a female basic wage set effectively at 54% of the male breadwinner rate and warned employers not to employ cheaper female labor in men's jobs. Unions subsequently succeeded in making repeated applications for jobs to be classified as male. As we shall see later, Hartman also refers to the example of the American example of the family wage to support her argument that there was a partnership between patriarchy and capitalism. So she says, unions subsequently succeeded in making repeated applications for jobs to be classified as male. That's very interesting. So you can see whenever there's like some sort of law, there's all of these ways that people try to, circumvent what the law says. It's really interesting here. Pateman uses such historical examples as evidence that the sexual contract precedes the employment contract. The implication being, as stated above, that capitalism is predicated upon female subordination. However, it will be suggested here that such contracts may have no inherent benefits for capitalist employers, but rather reflect a long struggle by male workers to consolidate their own superior position based on women's subordinate position in respect to the wage-labor relation. Their struggle was frequently aided by the patriarchal rather than the purely capitalist allegiances of male judges, politicians, and employers. Let us consider the concept of the family wage purely in terms of a possible logic of capitalism, that is, from an imagined vantage point of abstracted from actually existing historical relations, but based on arguments regarding financial advantage. To begin with, it should be noted that in Australia, at least, interpretations of the family wage are contentious, and that employers' preferred principle tended to be the capacity of industry to pay. However, the family wage seems a good deal for capitalists if, for example, one assumes that the only alternative was the employer to pay women the same as the higher rate that men were receiving. That would have been an ideal solution for feminists, but does not seem historically feasible alternative given that the higher male rate was set on the basis of dependent spouse as well as children. The more appropriate question to ask is why it would be to a capitalist financial advantage to pay a wage that can support 4 people yet only get the labor of 1. Wouldn't it be better to split the wage amount equally between husband and wife and get the labor of 2 employees? Or even better, to split the wage between 4 people if child labor was allowed? Man, that line is just, it sends shivers down your back when you hear feminists and their attack on the family as a form of subordination, when family is not something that capitalists created, right? Extended families, all of this individualization of society, all of our inability to keep our extended family together, all of these postmodern issues that we are having with regards to building community, with regards to people giving into their community beyond what they can, with regards to the death of volunteerism. It comes at the hands of feminists and their complicity with the capitalists. How evil this is. It's absolutely evil. And the way that they have a stranglehold on the academic institutions, and how it's so difficult to find this critique or tensions between patriarchy and capitalism as endemic to the very system that we find ourselves in, and how colonialism is so much deeper than all of these academic papers, these simple versions of intersectionality, these biased versions of intersectionality, these rainbow washing that's happening in the corporations, and how the right wing today, the evil right wing today, is speaking for the working class. Furthermore, if the capitalist were to employ both husband and wife, why would he or she benefit financially from employing the husband at the family wage rate and the wife at, for example, 54% of that rate? The capitalist would be paying 1.5 times that was necessary to support the family unit. Admittedly, capitalists employing predominantly female workforce might well benefit from paying only 54% of the male rate. But what about those capitalists employing predominantly male workforce? Their wage bill would be much higher than if they're paying males only 50% of the female of the family wage. See, there's a reason why unions are dead. There's a reason why unions are dead. Unions were once allied to communities. Unions were once allied to this idea of family. But the feminists, where they equated family with capitalism, it destroyed the power of the unions. Note, too, that if the family wage were split equally between male and female employers would be even cheaper. Proponents of the old housework debate, now we're going to get into the real moralization of the commodification of emotional labor, which I'm always talking about, may object that capitalists benefit from unpaid female labor that reproduces labor power more cheaply than if a wife's services were brought in the marketplace. Gardner, 1975. However, it is unclear why the labor couldn't be divided equally between male and female workers for less cost than the family wage. It is. Once again, too, one questions which capitalists benefit financially from female labor. It is capitalists selling convenience food and other domestic services? Is it capitalists employing predominantly female workforces in which women may have to take days off to look after sick children? Is it capitalists running childcare centers? In the later cases, the current division of labor disadvantages some capitalists and may not have particular advantages for others. Such examples suggest that the way in which the family wage developed may actually have been financially disadvantageous for capital and may have partly reflected the outcome of a long battle by many male workers in unions to improve their wages by excluding and marginalizing both women and children. In this case, by the Australian workforce, it also involved a long battle by many white males to exclude Chinese and Kanak workers. Pateman, in 1988, notes in passing that the history of the labor movement leaves no doubt that the insistence on a family wage was an important strategy through which men were able to exclude women from many areas of paid work and bolster the husband position as master of the home. But she doesn't discuss why this struggle was necessary. It was necessary because the capitalist employment contract, contrary to Pateman's view, posed a direct threat to an aspect of the marriage contract, namely who would have control over the components of female labor, as well as child labor, but we'll exclude that from the subject of discussion. Was it to be the husband or the capitalist? Exactly, right? So we've given this, oh my goodness. Feminism is in service. Intersectionality is in service to the capitalist class by destroying unions, by destroying families, and by destroying community, by moralizing the commodification of emotional labor through this neoliberal colonialism of the mind, this neoliberal subjectivity, this individual as a firm. All of these things come together, and we see that the left, just as the left always eats itself, the left is so busy in their hysteria of pointing at other people that they are unable to point the fingers at themselves. Ask, who are you to point the fingers, you complicit fools? How you have destroyed the unions, how you have destroyed the left. Thank you, Madame Johnson, in 1996 for this article. And so difficult to find such work as well. In the melange of all of these articles repeating the same fucking shit over and over and over again. Finally, some true, authentic, anti-capitalist work is happening here. Being a wage laborer is not freedom. This would have been a particularly important issue for the rural and town households in which males had controlled the female labor of housewifery, which Stevie Jackson, 1992, has pointed out involved production for both exchange and household use. The potential conflicts of interest between men and capitalists over the control of female labor has been acknowledged by Hartman, 1981, among others in the American context, but Hartman doesn't develop this insight because she then argues that capitalists realize that housewives produced and maintained healthier workers than wage-working wives. A point that still begs the question of whether domestic labor could have been shared between male and female workers, possibly at the cost of reducing working week, but in a way that still enabled capitalists to benefit from employing both male and female labor for the cost of a family wage. Indeed, the resolution of the tension between capitalism and patriarchy were far from a foregone conclusion. Some British examples are pertinent here. As a number of feminists pointed out, the history of the development of capitalist employment relations in Britain was particularly fraught for patriarchy, although Pateman does not refer to the feminist literature on this matter when citing British evidence to support her case on the wage contract. So what we're seeing here, in my ontotheological perspective, where I see all of these different systems as religious systems, is the death of one religion, the religion of patriarchy, the religion of the father, the religion of the family, in subservience to another more powerful religion, a religion that, when you pray to it, it has definite answers. The religion of capitalism. When you pray to any god, when you pray to your father, there's less of a chance of getting a response than when you pray to capitalism. When you pray to capitalism and you work hard and you do all the capitalist things, you get a return. You will get a return. Capitalism is the most powerful form of prayer, right? This is kind of my ontotheological perspective. What we're seeing here is one religion destroying and homogenizing another religion, or taking in another religion. Capitalist employment relations in the form of factory relations first developed in areas of female employment such as spinning, work that had been predominantly done by women in cottage industries. There was, therefore, initially a significant demand for female employment. The numbers of women employed in factory work should not be underestimated. In his 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels, 1975, cited extensive statistical evidence pointing to the disproportionate employment of women as opposed to adult males in the factory system. He also noted the just wrath aroused among the working men by his virtual castration and the reversal of all relations within the family, and argued that there were hundreds of families in Manchester alone where the wife supported the family, the husband sits at home, tends the children, sweeps the room, and cooks. Even when men were employed in factories, women would sometimes be employed in jobs earning more than them. However, unlike many trade unionists of the period, Engels did conclude that if the reign of the wife over the husband, as inevitably brought about by the factory system, is inhumane, the pristine rule of the husband over the wife must have been inhumane too. It was their observation of the early impact of capitalism that led Marx and Engels to their mistaken belief that capitalism would liberate women by increasing their participation in the public sphere. Mistaken partly because, given their belief that women's oppression arose from property ownership, they underestimated the working class men's response to the challenge of patriarchal relations. They also underestimated the extent to which men of other classes might place patriarchal allegiances before pecuniary ones. Now, what Marx and Engels here failed is that they thought that because you participate in capitalism, you can participate in the public sphere. But the problem here is that this increasing individualization actually destroys the public sphere. There is no public sphere left. The only public sphere we have right now is on Facebook, controlled by Zuckerberg. And now we see that it's the liberals who make arguments like, oh, well, this is a private organization, and because it's a private organization, Facebook can regulate what kind of politically correct, or whatever, Twitter can say whatever is politically correct. They can cancel whoever they want. But they don't understand that this is not a public sphere. This is a private sphere It's a privatized sphere. It's the liberals that are defending the private sphere. And what should really be happening is that we should be looking at the internet itself as a public sphere. It's a series of underground tubes or whatever. And that is the public sphere. The privatization and individualization of emotional labor, all of this cost-benefit analysis that coming into our interpersonal relations are destroying this idea of the public sphere. Marx said at some point that all relations will turn into liquid. And that's Marx doesn't even know how right he was. That's what Zizek says, right? Even right now, it's not just nature that is a solid thing. For Marx, nature was this vast reservoir that couldn't be liquefied into capital. But today, nature is liquefied into capital. Our sexual orientations and our genders are liquefied into capitalism. This is my point about intersectionality as being integral to the logic of neoliberal colonialism. There is no difference. All of this neoliberal subjectivity is created by capitalist systems, right? It's not revolutionary. It's not a revolution. Sorry, back to the text. It was therefore far from inevitable that men rather than women would inherently benefit from the capitalist employment contract in Britain, a point that tends to undermine Pateman's assertion that the wage contract was established upon the basis of the marriage contract and that the worker was indelibly constructed as male. Now we can see the articles, there's not enough economically attractive men, these kinds of articles, because millennial women make more than millennial men, supposedly, maybe, probably, much better than they did before. And even in that situation, it is the women that are imposing these patriarchal ideas on men. And it's insane how there's all of these left-wing, soy boys, as the right wing likes to call them, that defend these notions when they don't realize that this is the reason why the left is dying. This is the reason why all these people are voting right wing. Why do all these people vote right wing? Indeed, as Sheila Leeuwenhoek, 1977, has pointed out, there was a long history of women working for paid employment, and although female labor was generally paid less than males, this was not exclusively so. However, in the 19th century, male-dominated unions mobilized to exclude or marginalize women in areas as diverse as tailoring and mining. Male laborers often explicitly argued that this strategy would force capitalists to pay employees the equivalent of what they would previously pay for labor of the man, wife, and children. An argument that has led some commentators to support the strategy as justifiable. Humphreys, 1977, page 252. Despite Humphreys' arguments, it is clear that this strategy was based upon a patriarchal division of labor. The rationale lay not only in attempting to increase male dominance in wages and employment, but also in the home. So I guess the truly radical thing here would be to argue that any one person should be getting a family's wage labor. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. Right? That should really be the argument here. But instead, the very fact that it's so difficult to find such arguments, the very fact that the whole academic system, searching stuff on Google right now, it's so difficult to find these actual leftist arguments where, we see that there was this tension between patriarchy and capitalism, when we're not able to discuss and criticize and go deeper into all of these things. We could have come out to the conclusion that, it's not that we should be fighting for equal wage between men and women like the capitalists have been telling us, that the capitalists have been propagandizing us within the academic institutions. It's not that we should be arguing for that. We should be arguing for the family. We should be arguing that every person should get, at least the wage of a family so that they can start a family. That's where the argument should be going. But unfortunately, it's not going there. We could have had so much more productive left-wing arguments here. Instead, we are put at each other's throats. Opponents of female employment, such as the radical tailor Francis Place, noted that it will be found universally where men have opposed the employment of women, their wages are kept up to a point equal to the maintenance of a family. Taylor, 1983. He urges workers in other industries to follow the lead of the tailors so that women would become all that can be desired as a companionable wives. You see, this position of the household, being there for your children, is not, as the feminists have been arguing, I'm a male and I would love to be there to raise children and to be there in the life-giving process and the parenting process. But men have given that up. And women see this as a form of oppression rather than this amazing time to, be there for your child. And unfortunately, if it was the case that there was no complicity, we would see more male housewives, more male house husbands, I guess. Why aren't there more male house husbands, and why are there instead women arguing about the lack of economically viable men? The reason why there is a lack of economically viable men is because there's all of these affirmative action campaigns to, make liars like Carrie Burrasa get infinite amounts of grants. Whereas, oh my goodness, we live in such a topsy-turvy world, and it's so crazy that the left isn't able to take on the concept of complicity and incommensurability between intersectionality seriously. They live, and the worst part is that they don't actually take on the hard work of, seeing these types of arguments. And because everybody's so individualistic, that this kind of argument has fallen to the wayside. All right, back to the text. As Anne Phillips and Barbara Taylor 1986 point out, left to its own devices, capitalism might well have fulfilled the prophecies of Engels and others and effectively destroyed sexual divisions within the family by drawing women indiscriminately into the wage labor. But patriarchy intervened and ensured through the development of the family wage system that women's subordinate position within the family will be reproduced within wage labor. The Phillips and Taylor 1986 analysis reveals the problems. So see, this woman, Johnson, is truly a genius because she finds her argument within the argument of the people she's criticizing. And that's how you know someone's a real intelligent person. The Phillips and Taylor 1986 analysis reveals the problems in assuming that capitalist employment contracts were inherently based on patriarchal marriage contract, since a patriarchal form of the wage relation had to be fought for rather than being a foregone conclusion. Although Phillips and Taylor do not go on to consider the extent to which capitalism per se may actually be antithetical to patriarchy, their position does draw attention to the degree of antagonism that Pateman ignores and Hartman glosses over in her conception of a partnership. Unfortunately, as we have seen, Phillips did not develop this initial insight in her later characterizations of the relationships between capitalism and patriarchy. I'm reading this paper, I'm falling in love with this woman. Madame Johnson, can I wife you up? The issue of the early antagonism between, this is 1996, so I don't know how old she is now, but the issue of the early antagonism between capitalism and patriarchy has been addressed in more detail by Sylvia Welby, 1990. However, Welby had suggested that the tension between capitalism and patriarchy was largely resolved when patriarchy moved from a private to a public form in which cheap, sex-segregated, and casual female labor could be exploited by capitalists. In Welby's words, the main basis of the tension between capitalism and patriarchy is over the exploitation of women's labor. On the one hand, capitalists have interests in the recruitment and exploitation of female labor, which is cheaper than that of men because of the patriarchal structures. On the other, there is a resistance to this patriarchal strategy which seeks to maintain the exploitation of women in the household. Indeed, there was often a strong cross-class patriarchal alliance of strong male unions. However, this cross-class alliance had weaknesses when it cut across the interests of employers to recruit the cheap labor of women. an alternatively patriarchal strategy developed of allowing women into paid employment but segregating them from men and paying them less. I mean, the amount of topsy-turvy, backwards rationalization that's done. One thing that's, I just want to talk about these patriarchal alliances. When, I've never been shamed for the amount of money I make from other men, right? This kind of objectification, this real kinds of objectification that men face, right? On Reddit, there was recently a post about this guy who's wondering, oh, would you date a garbage man? And then there's all of these like platformed strawman responses that are actually the top voted, but also the most controversial. It's really crazy. Top voted and most controversial at the same time, where women are like, well, of course I'd date a garbage man, as long as he's sexy and whatever. But the issue here is that that's the kind of objectification that men are actually going through. Whereas, when you go to Reddit r men's lib, the kind of objectification that men actually don't give a shit about. Who cares about having a couple, muscle? I can go build muscle mass whenever I like. It comes and goes. Muscle mass is not really the big problem here. The form of objectification that's actually happening is that your worth as a man is based and tied to your utility. That's the objectification. And when you go ask a feminist, go ask our feminists, is this a form of objectification? Is judging a man based on his income a form of objectification? They will yell at you. They will scream at you. These fucking feminists, they will fucking go crazy over that question. Because that question reveals the inherent contradictions within their neoliberal feminism that they are actually promoting, right? One thing that I love about the brotherhood, this kind of brotherhood that is actually dead, is that, no matter who you're talking to, no matter how much money they are making, the brotherhood was really strong before in terms of, men would always treat each other as equals. This doesn't matter. You're a working man. Doesn't matter how much money you're making. Doesn't even matter if you're a banker or not. Actually, no, that's kind of a difference. But, as a working man, when you talk to other working men, there's a sense of brotherhood that's just unable to be destroyed. That is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the idea that emotional labor cannot be subsumed to the logic of the market. That is the revolutionary potential, right? And what the feminists have done is they've commodified emotional labor. And so they've taken that really revolutionary potential that comes from the family, that comes from the brotherhood, that comes from, maybe even the sisterhood. But, I don't know. The sisterhood right now is just anti-man. It's not really, the brotherhood was never anti-women. The brotherhood was just the fact that we all recognize that we are all in this subordinate position. And, brother, when people call each other brother or comrade, that was a really powerful thing. And that's almost not that, that can never die. No matter how much these feminists do whatever they do, that brotherhood can never die. That's how powerful it is. And I was same with actually emotional labor. No matter how much feminists try to commodify emotional labor, there will still always be love. There will always still be love. Right now, feminists are attacking even the notion of love as a form of patriarchal bullshit. When you see feminists on the internet, they're all warning each other about love bombing and all warning each other, and they're all reiterating these pop psychology idioms that attack romanticism. That romance cannot be destroyed by capitalism no matter what. That's how powerful it is. That's how powerful the brotherhood is. That's how powerful family is. That's how powerful kin-based relationships are. And all of these attacks coming out of neoliberal feminism, coming out of neoliberal intersectionality, trying to destroy these forms of thinking, these religions that have been, pushed to the periphery of our society, the periphery of our mental states, and are really only now just a privilege for some who are able to actually, relive that moment. I'm worried about the younger generation that has never had that kind of brotherhood, or even the idea of sportsmanship, right? Sportsmanship is another example of this. Male honor, right? Male honor is another example of this. Now, one of the other questions in feminism is always, what is the female version of the male mono myth? If you don't know what I'm talking about, Campbell's popularized mono myth. You can search that up. What is the female version of that? Because the mono myth allows for males to have such ideas of honor and risking one's life for something greater than oneself. All of these kinds of things. But what is feminist honor, right? Feminist honor is not being a Vichy feminist. Vichy feminists are these women who, when the Nazis took over, they easily switched sides and they started, mingling with the Nazis. And, some people could, and the crazy thing is that feminists today, they view the French, how the French punished these Vichy feminists after the war by shaving their heads and putting tattoos on them and stuff. Nazi tattoos on them. They defend, the feminists are actually defending these Vichy feminists today, rather than seeing them as really part and parcel to the system of oppression. That's why this book is really important. Sisters in Hate. We really need to talk about these women who are complicit in the system, because it's not just evil men. There is a replication happening there as well. There's a reproduction of white supremacy as well. There's a reproduction of hierarchical forms of thinking as well. And those are obviously the Vichy feminists. But as long as we are biased by this women are wonderful kind of critique, and we aren't able to critique as a form of love, this critiquing as a form of love is outlawed itself. As long as we aren't able to do that, the Vichy feminists will ultimately win, and the systems of oppression will ultimately win, whether it's neoliberal systems of oppression or it's these neo-patriarchal fascist forms of oppression. Notice that I'm very careful with not equating neoliberalism and capitalism with patriarchy. I don't do that because it doesn't exist, because intersectional analysis is oversimplifying the complications when it comes to complicity and incommensurability. Okay, back to the text. Or, as Walby sums up, as we move from the private to the public labor, women are no longer restricted to domestic hearth, but have the whole society in which to roam and be exploited. Walby suggests that this compromise particularly suits modern-day capitalism, which requires a flexible workforce. The major problem with Walby's depiction of the historical compromise between male labor and male capital is that it overlooks the implication discussed above that some capitalists, or often some capitalists, were having to pay male labor more than if the family wage had been divided equally between the husband and wife. The family wage may no longer exist, but higher wages for male-dominated jobs do. Why settle for cheap female labor when you could have had male labor as well? Why settle today for the flexibility of casual and part-time female labor if you could exploit a potential army of casual, part-time male labor as well? However, Walby's account is superior to that of Pateman in a number of respects. One of these is that she does acknowledge tensions between earlier forms of patriarchy and capitalism, even if she believes that those tensions were largely resolved with the move from private to public patriarchy. Indeed, Walby criticizes dual system theorists such as Hartman for assuming that there is primarily harmony between capitalists and patriarchal relations. Hartman has, and this is a fucking travesty, right? To think that the patriarchy in terms of labor, male labor and male capitalists are allied against women when they are the number one thing at war with each other. Hartman has recently reaffirmed her position, arguing that sex segregation, low female wages, and devalorization of non-market work are examples of a basic complementary between patriarchy and capitalism that has made patriarchy quite resistant to change. Pateman, as we have seen, in effect accepts the degree of harmony proposed by these theorists at face value, but criticizes them not for collapsing capitalism into patriarchy. The above arguments emphasize the fact that capitalism need not be inherently patriarchal. The fact that we currently live in a very gendered capitalist society is due to the fact that men of various classes mobilized to ensure that pre-existing patriarchal conditions continue to exist and interact within capitalist relations. You see, this kind of perspective that all men, are on the same boat, it basically comes down to the idea that feminists keep saying, oh, well, feminism is about equality. If you don't care about equality between men and women, then, or if you care about the equality between men and women, then you're a feminist too. When in fact, men and men are unequal. The obvious idea that men and men are unequal. As Welby points out, that mobilization frequently involved using the state to exclude, marginalize, and undervalue female labor, an option that has become less possible now women are gaining greater political rights and representation. Not surprisingly, there were frequent attempts to preclude women from emerging citizenship rights of liberal capitalist societies. The original draft of the People's Charter, keystone of the English Chartist movement, included a clause extending the suffrage to women, but this was dropped out almost immediately. Obviously, men of property were involved in attempting to block female suffrage. The point is not to paint working-class men as the worst enemies of women, but simply to question whether the inequality of women is a necessary feature of capitalism. It's not. The fact that working-class men played such an important role in helping to produce the patriarchal form of capitalism does, however, lend weight to the argument that women's subordination under capitalism is not due to the operation of capitalist interests per se. Male capitalists also wish to sustain existing conceptions of masculinity, for example, by paying men more and women less, or sex segregating the workforce. But if so, it was not due to any logic inherent in capitalist relations, but to their own patriarchal allegiances. Even in capitalist males, even in the rationale of capitalist males, the patriarchy is opposed to capitalism, always opposed. Indeed, the fact that most capitalists were male was due to pre-existing patriarchal property relations that restricted women's ability to own wealth in their own right, rather than to any inherent logic in the capitalist system which prevents women from being capitalists. Again, the idea of a patriarchal society is one where the male has property and the male is also has to put his life on the line to protect the republic, and in that sense, the male can participate. Once the male has property and once the male is contributing something to the public sphere, that is the only realm in which you have a vote in the public sphere, or a say in the public sphere. As Welby puts it, the development of capitalism opened up new sites of power, and these were colonized by men because they were strategically placed to do so. Why does it matter that so few feminists adequately explore the problems posed by the tension between capitalism and patriarchy? Now we're getting into the meta issue. I'm really wondering what she's going to say. Why does it matter that capitalism originally posed a threat to the marriage contract by challenging areas of the husband's control over the wife's labor? What are the political implications? For the implications go beyond issues of historical accuracy into what are called contemporary issues today. Pateman, for example, spends some time discussing two contemporary contracts that have important implications for women, namely prostitution and surrogacy contracts. Here, as elsewhere, she makes important contributions that go far beyond the limited aspects of her thought discussed in this article. However, while alerting us to the issue of subordination in contracts, she says relatively little concerning contemporary forms of the employment contract. These issues are particularly pertinent today, not only because of the seriousness of the international recession, but also because of the political movement to the right in many countries. This is in 1996, along with the related attacks on the union movement and centralized forms of wage fixation, have made the issue of employment contracts even more immediate. Many male wage earners may be particularly opposed to feminist demands because they could result in lower male wages, as higher male wages are divided up more equally, rather than in the more desirable option of the retention of existing high levels of male wages and an increase in female wages until they are equivalent to that level. Indeed, it could be the case that the reduction in some male wages has already happened in countries such as Sweden and Australia, which have attempted to redistribute from higher paid to lower paid workers of both sexes. Commentators on comparative wage figures have pointed out that the relative increase of female earnings in countries that have practiced wage compression is partly due to a reduction in wages going to higher paid, predominantly male workers. Note that such strategies can leave capital relatively unscathed, since it is a redistribution between wage earners that is occurring, not from capitalists to laborers. In other words, such strategies could be constructed as being favorable to capitalism while challenging aspects of patriarchy. This is in the Western context. This is my idea, and what I'm saying is that everywhere that capitalism goes, its first task is to destroy the traditional societies. Right now, the United Nations sends these feminists into far-off temples in the highest of mountains, where they try to impose ideas of individualism, ideas of Western autonomy, these kinds of Western ideas. And then they make these Buddhist monks, they ask them, why is there a gender role here? And the Buddhist monks are like, well, we've been doing this for 10,000 years. What the hell are you doing talking about? And then they write papers, right? Oh, why do these, after we've tried to indoctrinate these feminists, these women in these Buddhist societies, after we try to indoctrinate them, they still go back to their roles. I wonder why. Well, maybe because their religion is stronger than your religion. Capitalist restructuring also poses other questions. How will female and male workers fare as capitalism requires an increasingly flexible workforce? Will women tend to be marginalized in the growing part-time sector? Are we seeing in Pateman's 1988 terms a renegotiation of the relationship between the patriarchal and capitalist contracts, and will women still come out second? Will substantial sections of male trade unionists still try to negotiate an employment contract that favors male workers? Of course not. Or will the increased female influence in trade unions result in fairer decisions being made? There are no unions anymore. How will the employers respond? The predominantly male employers respond. As Henry and Franz Way indicate, after a survey of international material, the outcomes for women of political and industrial struggles over the present forms of capitalist restructuring are still far from clear and open up both utopian and dystopian possibilities. We're clearly past dystopia now. This is my whole point about cyberpunk. We are in the post-dystopian now. This is a 1996 article. So old, more than 20 years old now, she's talking about these important issues. A well-managed flexible labor market with permanent part-time work located in the core rather than the deregulated, non-unionized periphery might contribute to better working conditions for women, not only in terms of job security, skills recognition, and status, but also in terms of the potential for men to take up combinations of family and paid work responsibilities in ways which might lessen women's double burden. However, we share some skepticism as to how these changes should be interpreted and about the burgeoning human resources management industry. Alternatively, then, the new workforce could represent a return to 19th century conditions of work in which the strong are favored and the weak are exploited, particularly if unions are squeezed out of this new compact in New Zealand and United Kingdom. Exactly. This is exactly what happened. In 1993, this was written. Franz and Hanway. While the dystopian outcome seems quite possible, it's already happened. This is 1996. The question would still remain whether women's vulnerable position in the new workplace was due to factors inherent in capitalism itself or to factors inherent in the current patriarchal positioning of women within capitalism. The question also remains of whether, well, all these questions are answered now. It's just capitalism, not patriarchy. The question also remains of whether the tension between patriarchy and capitalism also opens up possibilities for some gains to be made by women. Yeah, this is a perfect point, right? This is a perfect point. Not just gains made by women, but actually talking about the tensions between our different forms of intersections, then can actually bring about something positive here. If we are able to look at conflict as something positive, then we can look at something, then we can find revolutionary potential in these questions. Unfortunately, everybody's repeating the same shit. All the academic papers are repeating the same shit. And this is why nobody actually trusts academia. This is why the working class don't trust universities anymore. For example, in the case of Australia, the Hawke Labour government introduced a number of pieces of legislation designed to improve women's participation in the workforce and justified the legislation on the grounds of the Australian capitalist economy needs to utilize skills regardless of gender if it is to overcome its vulnerable position in the international economy. Its successor, the Keating Labour government, justified major increases in child care expenditure on the grounds that they substantially increase the ability of women to work and so contribute their talents and abilities to our search for competitive advantage. I think that this kind of child care expenditure argument is actually kind of a tragedy in the wonderful possibility of raising your own children. Now you drop off children for other people to raise. And, I'm a teacher and I can see that there's so many students that just don't have parents. These rich kids especially don't have parents because both of their parents are working. I work in private schools and a lot of my rich kid students don't have parents. And it contributes to this destruction of the family, this destruction of the long range family, this destruction of our relationships with one another. It's a, as long as you can see that, this kind of capitalist argument is there for child care expenditure, it's not a socialist argument. Yet these governments, rather than being noted for their reforming policies, have been right-wing Labour governments highly supportive of Australian businesses and advocating deregulation, privatization, and public sector cutbacks. Admittedly, the feminist measures are given a low priority and the government macroeconomic policies still reflect male-defined conceptions, but Hawke and Keating governments are significantly improvements on their predecessors in terms of women's policy. While the struggle of the Australian feminist movement deserves the credit for many of these changes, one should not rule out that the possibility of these tensions between economic needs of capitalism and patriarchy have also a part to play. The Australian situation is far from unique in this respect. While accounts of new right-wing governments such as Margaret Thatcher's in Britain tend to stress the role they've played in encouraging traditional family structures as they wind back the services provided by the welfare state, there are tensions evident there too. Firstly, as Abbott and Wallace, 1989, have pointed out, Thatcher was actually criticized by the moral right for not going far enough in her support of the family. Furthermore, Franklin, Lurie, and Stacey have drawn attention to the complex reworking of many strands of feminism within the Thatcherite project, including her engagement with feminist language in areas such as individual choice and equal opportunities. In this reading, Thatcher herself, unlike some of her advisors and ministers, did not advocate women returning to the home. Rather, she was a post-feminist careerist who claimed that because there was no longer significant discrimination against women, women could successfully combine job and family commitments, particularly if they could afford domestic help. And now you see, people don't raise their own children. There's like these Filipino nannies that are raising everybody's children. There's teachers that are raising children. It's really disastrous in this. It's unfortunate. This is not to deny the disastrous effect that Thatcher's policy had on many women, particularly women who were of working class. One could argue that tensions also existed in the thought of new right policies in countries other than Britain. For example, while Australian Liberal Party documents privilege male-defined conceptions of the entrepreneurial citizen, leading members of the party, such as John Hewson, also claimed that the Liberals' emphasis on individualism will foster the aspirations of individual women better than Labour's more collectivist views. Indeed, Hewson, 1992, whose wife, Carolyn, is a merchant banker, stresses that women can beat men in the most rough and tumble competition, including, presumably, the market. Socialist feminists have rightly pointed out that rather than having economic benefits that trickle down to the disadvantage, free market policies generally have had very bad consequences for those who are dependent on welfare benefits and who are in a weak economic position in the labor market, including the majority of women. So, most of these articles that I'm reading, that I'm trying to look for, that actually criticize the public narrative, these idioms, these neoliberal idioms, their articles start with maximum amount of qualification and head raising and, oh yes, the public narrative is correct. And then the article ends again with, oh yes, the public narrative is correct, even though, I've had so many different questions about it. It's like this, it's very similar to like theocracy, where you're like, oh, well, of course God exists in the beginning. And then you go and you just criticize a bunch of things about God might not be existing. And then at the end of the article, you're like, oh, well, of course God exists, and you have to keep doing this. And that's part of this fucking indoctrination that we are all dealing with in the universities, and why universities are stupid now, and why there's more philosophy happening in Wendy's than in philosophical departments today. However, the issue is whether there is something inherent in capitalism which requires women to be in such an economically disadvantaged position, or whether, as suggested here, that gendered location is due solely to patriarchal influences and mobilizations. In this scenario, it would be conceivably possible in some future form of capitalist society for free market policies to be gender neutral, while still having detrimental effects on both men and women in terms of their class position. In other words, capitalists do benefit from paying particularly low wages to some workers, but gender need not be a factor in determining whose those low-paid workers are. In fact, if we live in a kind of virtue signaling world, gender is a factor of who those low-paid workers are, because you need to meet these quotas, affirmative action quotas. Similarly, it would be conceivable to imagine a society in which welfare services were cut, but the burden fell equally upon both men and women in the home. It still doesn't, because you can see that it's the women who maintain these patriarchal expectations on men. It is therefore important to note that even new right policies, rather than simply revealing a complete compatibility between capitalism and patriarchy, can also reveal some real tensions. While male capitalists, who are currently in the vast majority, may sometimes have conflicts between their perceived interests, for example, as males wishing to reproduce masculine power in the workplace and as capitalists wishing to exploit labor irresolvable of sex, female capitalists may encounter fewer personal contradictions in rushing to exploit men equally with women. That is a massively awesome point. Men have this ideas of honor that make them not exploit surplus labor as much, whereas female capitalists may encounter fewer personal contradictions when it comes to the question of exploiting surplus labor. That's what I'm talking about. Seen in this way, it is not surprising that women, calling themselves feminists, can be attracted to right-wing economic thought. Hence, the pro-feminist views of laissez-faire conservatives interviewed by Clatch, in America by the libertarian feminists interviewed by Campbell. Britain, their feminism is grounded in a belief that individual women should be able to advance through class hierarchies rather than an ethic of collective care or sisterhood. But it is a form of liberal feminism nonetheless. While right-wing thought is often literally constructed around conceptions of rational economic man, the self-reliant individual of laissez-faire economics could conceivably be reconstructed as gender neutral. For once patriarchy is theoretically severed from capitalism, feminism will no longer be predominantly the property of the left. Nor, as Pateman, 1988, mistakenly implies, does feminism in general necessarily presuppose a critique of capitalism, although many socialist feminists will remain critical of it. Just as class reductionist explanations of patriarchy need to be rejected, so do gender reductionist explanations of capitalism. Neither class relations nor the marriage contract can provide universal explanations for the complex social and political relations within which we live. So I'm just going to end once again citing Adrian Johnston, who says that it's not the Marxist reductionists that are reducing these, intersectional kinds of complicated intersectional analysis into, Marxist determinist class analyses. It's that the capitalism itself turns everything into liquid. Capitalism itself turns everything into mechanistic forms of relationships. That's the first thing. And the second thing I want to say is that there are no socialist feminists anymore, because all feminists have normalized these ideas that you don't owe anyone anything and you don't have to contribute to the public sphere, and this is why feminists are only helping other females when it comes to feminists are always saying stuff like, oh, well, I want to make enough money to help myself and then help other women, rather than seeing us as all part of the same society. So again, I'm going to end on the note that I really need to say here once more, is that if we cannot really, truly understand that incommensurability between all of our different intersections is actually a difficult thing to do, rather than doing this rainbow washing capitalism, if we can't deal with that, and we cannot deal with our own complicity with regards to maintaining the patriarchy in some forms or maintaining the capitalism in other forms, the reason why I come out and say this stuff about patriarchy as being opposed to capitalism is not because I'm trying to maintain the patriarchy. I am trying to find a connection between these academics in their ivory tower, their polarized echo chamber ivory towers, their polarized citational echo chamber ivory towers, with the other polarized echo chamber, which is these mass of people, these 30% of Latin American people, all the 50% of white feminists, all of these people who vote right-wing, who feel that they need to vote right-wing. Right? There's a reason why the working class votes right-wing. And if we can't deal with that, well, I guess we really need to make friends with the dystopia. And that's basically what my whole argument about our cyberpunk is all about. Check it out. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And I'm hoping to see if you have any critiques about what I'm talking about. And I hope it's not too much emotional labor for you to participate. All the best.